They didn't issue a correction. They didn't clarify anything. They didn't even explain themselves. They just deleted it. 1 minute, the WNBA was publicly celebrating Caitlin Clark landing one of the biggest media opportunities any women's basketball player has ever received. The next minute, the post was gone, wiped like it never existed. No follow-up, no explanation, no accountability. And that silence is exactly why this story matters. Because leagues don't erase posts about their biggest star unless something seriously rattled them. This wasn't a typo. This wasn't a scheduling mistake. This wasn't an intern hitting the wrong button. This was a panic move, the kind organizations make when they realize they've stepped on a landmine they didn't think was there. At first glance, it looked harmless. Caitlin Clark signing on with NBC for NBA coverage, All-Star Weekend appearances, and national broadcasts. A win for her. A win for the league. A win for women's basketball visibility. So why did it spark outrage? Why did the comment sections spiral out of control almost instantly? And why did the WNBA respond by doing the one thing that guarantees more backlash, pretending it never happened? Because this wasn't about one post. It wasn't about one deal. And it definitely wasn't about basketball. This was the moment years of tension finally surfaced. A collision between star power, media control, identity politics, and a league that still hasn't decided what it wants to be. And once Caitlin Clark's name got attached to an NBA media platform, everything the WNBA has been quietly struggling to manage came rushing to the surface at once. But to understand why that delete button mattered so much, you have to understand what this NBC deal actually represents, and why it quietly changed Caitlin Clark's position in the entire sports world. And that part of the story, almost nobody is talking about it. On paper, it was just a media job. A talented basketball mind getting invited into studio shows. Some all-star weekend coverage. Occasional analysis. The kind of thing athletes do all the time once they've built a name. But this wasn't just any media job. This was NBC. And not WNBA coverage. Not women's college basketball. Not a niche panel tucked away on a streaming-only broadcast. This was NBA media. That distinction matters more than people realize. Because when a WNBA player crosses into NBA broadcast space, it's not just about talking hoops. It's about credibility. It's about reach. It's about being seen as a basketball voice, not a women's basketball voice. Not a token segment, not a diversity box, but an analyst trusted to speak on the biggest stage the sport has. That door has been historically closed. For decades, women's basketball players were told their future was coaching, overseas leagues, or commentary limited to women's games. NBA studio desks were protected territory. You didn't just walk into that ecosystem unless the network believed you could bring ratings, attention, and legitimacy. NBC doesn't make sentimental hires. They make strategic ones, which is exactly why this deal hit differently. Caitlin Clark wasn't invited because she checked a box. She was invited because she moves numbers. She drives conversation. She pulls casual fans into serious basketball discussions. And networks don't ignore that kind of gravity, especially not when they're rebuilding NBA coverage and looking for fresh faces who already dominate social media algorithms. The WNBA should have recognized this instantly. This was leverage. This was proof that one of their players had transcended the league's ecosystem and entered the broader sports economy, something the WNBA has been chasing for years. And for a brief moment, they did recognize it. They posted the announcement like a victory lap. Clean graphics, professional wording, standard league promotion. The exact same kind of post they've proudly rolled out for magazine covers, award wins, and endorsement deals for other stars. No hesitation. No qualifiers. No disclaimers. Which is why what happened next caught them completely off guard. Because the moment that post went live, the conversation stopped being about Caitlin Clark's basketball IQ or her on-court impact, and turned into something else entirely. The comments didn't debate her credentials. They didn't analyze her stats. They didn't argue whether she deserved the opportunity. Instead, the backlash zeroed in on why she was getting it at all. Why her? Why now? Why NBC? And that shift is where the ground started shaking. Because once fans and media figures, some loud, some influential, began framing the deal as symbolic rather than earned, the league found itself trapped in a narrative it didn't know how to control. Promoting the deal suddenly meant taking a stance. Leaving the post up meant inviting more outrage. Defending it meant choosing sides. And the WNBA, historically uncomfortable with confrontation, did what it's done far too many times before. They erased the evidence. But that erase didn't make the situation disappear. It amplified it. Because now the question wasn't just why Caitlin Clark got the NBC deal. The question became, why was the league so afraid to stand behind it? And once people started asking that, the story stopped being about a media contract and became about the league's identity crisis. And the backlash that followed? That was only the beginning. Because what happened in those comments exposed a fault line that's been quietly widening for years, and Caitlin Clark just happened to step directly on it. And next, we need to talk about what that backlash actually looked like, who was driving it, and why it escalated so fast the league felt forced to hit delete. Because that part of the story explains everything that came after. The reaction was immediate. Not gradual. Not mixed. Not confused. Immediate. Within minutes of the post going live, the comment sections stopped looking like a celebration and started looking like a battlefield. And what stood out right away wasn't just the volume of criticism, it was the direction of it. Because almost none of it was about basketball. You didn't see long debates about whether Caitlin Clark understood NBA schemes well enough. You didn't see breakdowns of her film knowledge or questions about her preparation. Nobody was arguing that she lacked experience or that she hadn't proven herself on the court. Instead, the backlash went somewhere else entirely. People started questioning why she was chosen rather than what she had earned. They framed the deal as symbolic, political, loaded, as if her presence on an NBA broadcast desk wasn't the result of ratings, relevance, and market pull, but something more controversial. That's when the tone shifted. Suddenly, this wasn't a league celebrating one of its own. This was a public interrogation, a demand for justification, a rewriting of the narrative in real time. And the most revealing part? The people driving the outrage weren't casual fans who stumbled across the post. They were deeply embedded voices, media-adjacent accounts, opinion leaders, people whose commentary regularly gets amplified inside WNBA discourse. Instead of saying, "This is huge for the league," the reaction became, "Why is she getting this opportunity?" That framing matters. Because once a conversation moves from merit to motive, there's no clean way out. Every achievement becomes suspect. Every win becomes controversial. Every opportunity turns into a referendum. And that's exactly what happened here. People began searching Caitlin Clark's past, not her stat lines. Old interviews, old tweets, old clips, not to understand her basketball mind, but to find something, anything, that could justify the outrage they already felt. It wasn't about her knowledge of the game. It wasn't about her preparation. It wasn't about whether she could deliver on air. It was about whether she deserved visibility. And that's a dangerous place for a league to let the conversation go. Because once visibility itself becomes controversial, promoting your stars turns into a liability. The irony is, this exact moment should have been unifying. A WNBA player stepping into NBA media should have been framed as progress, a crack in a door that's been closed for decades. Instead, it became a loyalty test. Support the post, and you were accused of ignoring deeper issues. Question it, and you were suddenly part of the outrage machine. And the WNBA watched all of this unfold in real time. They saw the replies pile up. They saw quote tweets multiply. They saw narratives forming that they hadn't planned for. And here's where things get uncomfortable. This wasn't new. Caitlin Clark had already been here before. Every major milestone in her career had followed the same arc. First came the achievement. Then came the celebration. Then came the pivot, where the conversation stopped being about basketball and started being about what her success supposedly represented. Rookie of the Year? Suddenly the discourse wasn't about her impact, but about voting motives. All WNBA recognition? The focus shifted away from performance and toward implication. Record-breaking games? The highlight wasn't the numbers, it was the reaction to the attention. This NBC deal just happened to be the moment where all of that tension collided with the league's own promotional machinery. And when that happens, organizations panic. Because defending the post would have required the WNBA to take a clear stance. It would have meant saying, publicly and confidently, that Caitlin Clark earned this opportunity, that her voice belongs in NBA media spaces, that star power matters. That visibility isn't something to apologize for. But silence is easier than leadership, and deletion is easier than confrontation. So instead of addressing the backlash head-on, the league chose the path of least resistance, hoping the controversy would burn itself out if they removed the spark. What they didn't realize was that deleting the post didn't calm anything down. It confirmed every suspicion. To critics, it looked like guilt. To fans, it looked like cowardice. To casual observers, it looked confusing. And to Caitlin Clark, it looked like the league was unwilling to stand behind its own star the moment things got uncomfortable. And that's when the conversation truly flipped. Because now, the outrage wasn't just about the deal. It was about the league itself. Why promote her achievements one day and erase them the next? Why celebrate star power until it becomes inconvenient? Why ask players to grow the game, then shrink when they actually do? Those questions didn't fade. They grew. And the deleted post became more than a PR mistake. It became a symbol. A snapshot of a league caught between two identities, one rooted in competitive sports, the other trapped in perpetual controversy management. And once that symbol took hold, the damage was already done. Because fans started connecting dots. And when they did, they realized this wasn't an isolated incident at all. It was a pattern. And that pattern is exactly what we need to talk about next. Because once you see how often this has happened, the Caitlin Clark situation stops feeling shocking and starts feeling inevitable. Deleting a post seems small. One click, one decision, a moment that disappears from the timeline. But in the world of professional sports leagues, deletions speak louder than statements. Because when a league deletes something, it's admitting that the message was a mistake, not factually but politically. And that's the part the WNBA didn't seem to grasp when they made that decision. At no point did the league claim the NBC announcement was inaccurate. They didn't say it was premature. They didn't say Caitlin Clark hadn't finalized the deal. They didn't even suggest the post was misleading. They simply removed it, which means the issue wasn't the content. It was the reaction. And when an organization responds to outrage by erasing its own promotion, it sends a message far beyond that single post. It says, we don't trust our own decision. It says, we're not prepared to defend our stars. And most importantly, it says, loud voices matter more than earned success. That's why this moment struck such a nerve. Because fans didn't just see a deleted graphic. They saw a league flinch. Think about how rare this actually is in professional sports. When an NBA player signs a media deal, leagues amplify it. When NFL players land broadcasting roles, it's treated as a badge of honor. Networks want former players. Leagues want their stars everywhere. Visibility is currency. No one deletes those announcements because some fans get mad. But here, the WNBA folded. And once people noticed that, the narrative exploded. Screenshots started circulating. People reposted the graphic that was supposedly never there. Fans began asking why a league so desperate for mainstream attention would erase one of its biggest crossover moments. And there was no answer. Silence filled the gap. And silence, in moments like this, doesn't calm people down. It lets them write their own conclusions. Some saw the deletion as fear. Others saw it as appeasement. Many saw it as proof the league still doesn't know how to handle star power. But nearly everyone agreed on one thing. If Caitlin Clark had been anyone else, that post would still be up. And that realization forced people to revisit past moments, moments that suddenly looked a lot less isolated. Because once you start paying attention, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Big Caitlin Clark moment. Initial celebration. Immediate backlash. League hesitates. Conversation derails. Repeat. The deleted post wasn't an outlier. It was the latest example. And the damage wasn't just public perception, it was internal. Players notice this stuff. Agents notice. Networks notice. Sponsors notice. They all take mental notes about which leagues protect their stars and which ones retreat at the first sign of controversy. And that matters, especially now. Because the WNBA is in a fragile growth window. Media rights negotiations. Increased visibility. New fans entering the ecosystem for the first time. Moments like this shape how those fans decide whether the league is worth investing in emotionally. Deleting the post told casual fans something they didn't need to be told. That this league still gets uncomfortable when one player becomes bigger than the system around her. And for a league that needs stars to survive, that's a dangerous signal to send. What made it worse was the inconsistency. The WNBA has never shied away from promoting its stars before. Time magazine covers. Award ceremonies. Signature shoes. Historic stat lines. Those moments were plastered everywhere, proudly, aggressively, unapologetically. No hesitation. No deletion. No fear. So why was this different? That question hung in the air. And the lack of an official explanation made it louder. Fans weren't asking for a debate. They weren't demanding arguments in comment sections. They just wanted clarity. Instead, they got silence. And silence created a vacuum. One filled by speculation, frustration, and resentment. Because now, the issue wasn't Caitlin Clark's NBC deal. It was trust. Could the league be trusted to stand behind its players? Could it be trusted to promote success consistently? Could it be trusted to prioritize basketball over online outrage? And once those questions enter the conversation, they don't leave easily. This moment forced fans to confront something uncomfortable. That maybe the WNBA doesn't just struggle with marketing. Maybe it struggles with conviction. And that struggle didn't start with Caitlin Clark. It's been building for years, quietly, repeatedly, and predictably. And to understand how deep it goes, you have to look at the double standard that keeps showing up whenever her name enters the spotlight. Because once you see it laid out, the deleted post stops feeling confusing and starts feeling inevitable. At first, people tried to give the league the benefit of the doubt. Maybe this was a one-off. Maybe emotions were just running hot. Maybe the timing was bad. But once fans started replaying the last few years in their heads, a pattern snapped into focus, and it was impossible to unsee. Because Caitlin Clark's NBC situation didn't exist in isolation. It fit perfectly into a cycle that had already played out again and again. Every time Caitlin Clark reached a new level of success, the response followed the same strange formula. Achievement first, celebration second, controversy third, and then, almost always, a shift away from basketball entirely. When she won Rookie of the Year, it should have been a clean moment. Dominant numbers, immediate impact, sold-out arenas, national attention, the kind of rookie season leagues dream about. Instead of that conversation lasting, it got hijacked. Suddenly, the discussion wasn't about production or influence. It was about why she won, voting motives, media bias, everything except the actual season she just played. When she made All-WNBA first team, the same thing happened. Rather than breaking down her efficiency, her shot creation, or how defenses had to completely reshape themselves to deal with her range, the discourse shifted into comparison warfare. Who was snubbed? Who was wronged? What it supposedly symbolized? And once again, the basketball itself got buried. Even her most iconic performances followed the same script. Record-breaking games weren't allowed to just exist as record-breaking games. Near triple-doubles didn't stand on their own. Instead, people immediately searched for something to dilute the moment. Noise in the arena, officiating conspiracies, external explanations. Anything but simple dominance. What fans started noticing wasn't that criticism existed. Criticism is part of sports. It was that the criticism always arrived in the same way and pointed in the same direction. Toward legitimacy. Toward permission. Toward whether Caitlin Clark was allowed to be celebrated at the level her impact demanded. And that's the double standard that finally broke through during the NBC deal. Other stars received recognition, and it was treated as additive. Caitlin's recognition kept being treated as provocative. Not because she hadn't earned it, but because of what her success forced people to confront. Her popularity didn't stay inside traditional WNBA circles. It pulled in casual fans, new viewers, people who didn't speak the same cultural language as longtime insiders. And for a league still trying to define its identity, that created friction. Some embraced it, others resented it, and the league kept trying to balance both sides. But balance doesn't work when one side demands erasure. And that's what made the deleted post so revealing. Fans weren't just reacting emotionally. They were connecting dots. They saw how achievements by other stars were amplified without hesitation. Magazine covers stayed up. Shoe deals stayed promoted. Awards were celebrated loudly and consistently. No qualifiers. No backtracking. No fear of backlash. But with Caitlin Clark, celebration always came with an expiration date. The moment it triggered discomfort, the tone shifted. And that inconsistency started costing the league credibility. Because sports fans can tolerate a lot. They can tolerate bad calls. They can tolerate losing seasons. They can tolerate debate. What they don't tolerate is selective standards. If merit matters, it has to matter every time. If visibility is good, It has to be good consistently. If star power is something you want, you can't punish it when it shows up louder than expected. By deleting the NBC post, the league unintentionally confirmed what many fans had quietly suspected. That Caitlin Clark's success wasn't being judged by the same rules. And that realization didn't just frustrate fans, it alienated them. Because casual viewers don't want to be told how to feel about greatness. They want to watch it, celebrate it, debate it on basketball terms. Instead, they were being pulled into conflicts they didn't sign up for. And once people feel that kind of friction, they disengage. That's the real danger here. Not outrage, not criticism, not even controversy. Apathy. When fans start saying, "Why bother?" that's when leagues lose momentum. And that's exactly what the WNBA risked by handling Caitlin Clark's rise the way it did. The NBC deal just made the double standard impossible to ignore. Because now, the question wasn't whether Caitlin Clark was being treated differently. The question was why. And to answer that, you have to look beyond fans and into the media ecosystem shaping these narratives, because that's where the pressure really comes from. And once you see how that system works, the league's reaction starts to make a lot more sense, even if it makes the situation far worse. This is where the story stops being about one player and starts being about power. Because the backlash to Caitlin Clark's NBC deal didn't come out of nowhere. It didn't materialize randomly. And it definitely wasn't driven by people who just happened to be scrolling social media that day. It was fueled by a media ecosystem that has been shaping WNBA discourse for years, quietly, consistently, and with very little scrutiny. On the surface, WNBA media looks like any other sports media space. Analysts, former players, commentators, talking heads breaking down games and storylines. But once you pay closer attention, something feels different. The lines between analysis, advocacy, ownership, and influence are blurred, sometimes completely erased. And when that happens, narratives stop being about performance and start being about positioning. Some voices inside WNBA media aren't just observers. They're stakeholders, team owners, league partners, insiders with reputations to protect and alliances to maintain. That matters. Because when media figures have skin in the game beyond commentary, objectivity becomes optional, and messaging becomes strategic. This isn't about whether former players should have media jobs. They should. Experience matters. Perspective matters. Insight matters. The issue is transparency. In most professional sports, conflicts of interest are disclosed loudly. If someone owns a team, that's known. If someone has a business stake, it's acknowledged. In the WNBA ecosystem, those lines are often invisible to casual fans. So when narratives start forming, especially around a player as polarizing as Caitlin Clark, they don't feel organic. They feel coordinated. And fans sense that. Instead of hearing breakdowns of defensive coverages or off-ball movement, they hear framing, reframing, recontextualizing. Success is no longer just success. It's something that needs interpretation, something that needs explanation, something that needs to be managed. That's why Caitlin Clark's rise has felt different. She doesn't fit neatly into the existing narrative structures. She didn't come up through the same pipelines. Her fan base doesn't behave the same way. Her visibility extends far beyond traditional WNBA spaces, and that makes her harder to control. When she dominates, it disrupts the balance of attention. When she draws ratings, it shifts leverage. When networks like NBC invest in her voice, it threatens the gatekeeping role that some media figures have grown comfortable with. So instead of embracing that disruption, the ecosystem resists it. And resistance doesn't always look like criticism. Sometimes it looks like reframing. Sometimes it looks like silence. And sometimes it looks like manufactured controversy. That's why so much of the backlash around Caitlin Clark has felt detached from basketball reality. It's not about her shooting range. It's not about her playmaking. It's not about her impact on winning. It's about narrative ownership. Who gets to define what success means? Who gets to decide which stars are celebrated without pushback? Who gets to frame visibility as earned versus problematic? And when Caitlin Clark stepped into NBA media territory with NBC, that balance shifted in a way the ecosystem wasn't prepared for. Because now, she wasn't just a WNBA player being discussed by WNBA media. She was a national basketball figure being validated by one of the biggest networks in sports. That validation didn't come from inside the bubble. It came from outside. And that's what rattled people. Because once outside validation enters the picture, internal narratives lose power. The league found itself caught in the middle of that tension. On one side, mainstream networks treating Caitlin Clark like a legitimate basketball analyst and star. On the other, internal voices framing her success as something that needed constant qualification. Instead of choosing clarity, the league tried to appease both sides. And that never works. Because appeasement satisfies no one. Fans saw the inconsistency. Casual viewers felt the friction. And the media ecosystem doubled down, because that's what systems do when challenged. The result: a league that looks uncertain, a star that looks unsupported, and a media environment that feels increasingly disconnected from the actual games being played. And that disconnect has consequences. Because while debates rage online, something important happened in 2024 that almost everyone agrees on. For the first time in a long time, the WNBA felt like it was being treated as a serious sports league by the broader public. Real analysis, real debate, real coverage. And that momentum didn't come from internal media narratives. It came from the outside world finally paying attention, which makes what happened next even more frustrating. Because just as the league had momentum, it started undoing it from within. And to understand how big that missed opportunity really was, you have to look at what 2024 represented, and why it mattered more than anyone realized. That's where this story goes next. For the first time in a long time, something felt different. Not forced, not manufactured, not propped up by slogans or campaigns. Different in a way fans could feel. During the 2024 season, the WNBA wasn't just being talked about, it was being covered. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. Games weren't treated like side notes anymore. They were debated, broken down, argued over, highlighted for strategy, execution, and tension, not just storylines. Mainstream sports shows started discussing WNBA matchups the same way they discuss NBA games. Analysts pulled up clips. They talked spacing, shot selection, defensive adjustments. The conversation finally centered on basketball. And the audience responded. Ratings climbed. Attendance surged. Social engagement exploded. For the first time, casual fans didn't feel like outsiders walking into a closed room. They felt invited. They felt like they could watch a game, understand what was happening, and argue about it the same way they argue about any other sport. Caitlin Clark was a huge part of that shift, but she wasn't the only reason it worked. Her presence acted like a gateway. People tuned in for her range, her confidence, her ability to stretch defenses past logic. But once they were watching, they stayed for everything else. Aya Wilson's dominance became unavoidable. Playoff intensity felt real. Rivalries had teeth. The league finally looked like what it's always wanted to be, a legitimate competitive product. And here's the most important part. That legitimacy didn't come from internal messaging. It came from external validation. Networks treated the league seriously because the games demanded it. Not because of campaigns. Not because of activism. Because the basketball was undeniable. This was the proof of concept the WNBA needed. It showed that if you let the product speak, the audience will follow. Which is why what happened next felt so confusing. Because instead of leaning into that momentum, the league started retreating. Moments that should have been celebrated became controversial. Storylines that should have been simple became politicized. Achievements that should have been amplified got diluted by debate that had nothing to do with the court. The Caitlin Clark NBC deal landed right in the middle of this contradiction. On one hand, it represented everything 2024 had unlocked. A WNBA player being treated as a national basketball figure. A star crossing into mainstream media on merit. On the other hand, it exposed how fragile that progress still was. Because the league wasn't ready to fully commit to the version of itself that 2024 revealed. It still hesitated. It still second-guessed. It still tried to manage perception instead of trusting performance. And that hesitation matters more than people think. Because growth windows don't stay open forever. Sports leagues grow when momentum compounds. When fans feel rewarded for investing time and emotion. When stars are protected and elevated. But momentum collapses when uncertainty creeps in. When fans feel like the league itself doesn't believe in what it's selling. The deletion of the NBC post wasn't just a PR mistake in an otherwise successful season. It was a signal. A signal that despite all the progress, The league was still uncomfortable with one player becoming bigger than the ecosystem designed to contain her. And that discomfort has consequences. Because while stars like Caitlin Clark can absorb criticism, the league around her can't afford instability. Especially when the stakes are as high as they are right now. Media rights negotiations, player salary disputes, expansion conversations. All of it depends on credibility. And credibility depends on consistency. Which brings us to the part of this story that often gets overlooked. Because while fans argue online and media figures debate narratives, there's a group quietly watching all of this with growing anxiety. The players who don't have endorsement deals. The players who don't have leverage. The players whose careers depend on the league staying stable. And once you understand what this environment means for them, the Caitlin Clark situation stops being about fame and starts being about survival. That's the next piece of this story, and it might be the most important one. While the spotlight stays fixed on Caitlin Clark, something quieter is happening in the background. And it's easy to miss because it doesn't trend. These aren't the stars on national commercials. They aren't the names driving debates on sports shows. They aren't the faces networks build segments around. They're the players whose careers live in the margins. Second-round picks. End-of-rotation contributors. Rookies trying to survive long enough to earn a second contract. For them, league instability isn't abstract. It's not a talking point. It's not a philosophical debate. It's their entire future. When the WNBA hesitates publicly, when it caves to backlash, when it looks unsure of its own direction, it sends ripples through every locker room in the league. Because players understand leverage. They know who has it and who doesn't. Stars like Caitlin Clark can survive turbulence. They have endorsements, media opportunities, overseas options, a safety net that extends beyond the league itself. But most players don't. For many, the WNBA is the difference between building a career and starting over entirely. That's why moments like the deleted post matter so much internally. They signal uncertainty. If the league isn't willing to stand firmly behind its biggest star, what does that say about its willingness to protect anyone else? This is where the conversation about strikes, lockouts, and labor tension quietly enters the picture. Because instability at the top always trickles down. When media narratives push toward constant controversy, when public confidence wavers, negotiations become harder. Trust erodes, and players who should be focused on development start worrying about survival. A delayed season doesn't hurt stars nearly as much as it hurts fringe players. A lockout doesn't dent endorsement income, it wipes out livelihoods. For someone drafted late, missing a year can mean never getting another chance. It can mean losing momentum, losing visibility, losing relevance. That's the reality no one likes to talk about when outrage dominates the conversation. The loudest voices online won't lose anything if the league stumbles. Media personalities still have platforms. Analysts still have shows. Influencers still have audiences. But the player fighting for a roster spot doesn't get that luxury. They don't get to wait out chaos. And this is why the Caitlin Clark situation created so much quiet anxiety inside the league. Because it suggested that the WNBA is still reactive, still guided by pressure instead of principle. And for players without leverage, that's terrifying. They don't need perfection. They don't need unanimity. They need stability. They need to believe the league knows who it is and where it's going. Deleting posts, avoiding clarity, and letting narratives spiral sends the opposite message. It says the league is still unsure of itself. And when a league is unsure of itself, everyone beneath the top tier feels it first. This is where the Caitlin Clark quits the WNBA framing starts to make sense. Not literally, but symbolically. Because the real story isn't about her leaving. It's about the idea that she doesn't need the league the way the league needs her. And once that reality becomes obvious, the power dynamic shifts in a way that makes everyone uncomfortable. Especially leadership. Especially media. Especially a system that spent years trying to control the narrative rather than adapt to change. That shift is what really shook the league. Not the NBC deal itself. Not the backlash. Not the deleted post. The realization that the center of gravity was moving. And once that gravity shifts, nothing looks the same again. Which brings us to the question everyone keeps dancing around but never directly addresses. Did Caitlin Clark actually quit the WNBA? Or did she do something far more disruptive than that? That's where this story goes next. Here's the truth most headlines won't touch. Caitlin Clark didn't quit the WNBA. Not officially. Not contractually. Not in any way that shows up on a transaction wire. But something did change. And in some ways, it was far more disruptive than a resignation ever could be. What Caitlin Clark actually did was step outside the traditional power structure of the league and prove she could thrive there. That's what shook people. For decades, the WNBA has operated on a quiet assumption. The league is the center of gravity. Players come in, build their profile inside the system, and whatever opportunities follow are downstream from that. Caitlin Clark broke that sequence. Her NBC deal didn't come because the WNBA positioned her for it. It came because her relevance had already spilled beyond the league's boundaries. She didn't need permission. She didn't need alignment. She didn't need internal validation. Networks saw value, and they acted. That's why the quit framing caught fire so fast. It wasn't literal, but it captured something emotionally true. For the first time, a WNBA player had options that weren't dependent on league approval. And that changes everything. Because when a player has leverage outside the system loses control over the narrative. Caitlin Clark didn't walk away from games. She didn't abandon teammates. She didn't disengage from competition. What she did was demonstrate independence. And independence is threatening to any organization that's still figuring itself out. The league wants stars, but it also wants containment. Visibility, but on its terms. Growth, but in a way that doesn't destabilize existing hierarchies. Caitlin Clark's career doesn't fit neatly into those boundaries. She doesn't rely solely on WNBA media. She doesn't need internal validation to remain relevant. She doesn't disappear if the league goes quiet. That reality sits uncomfortably with leadership and media alike. Because if Caitlin Clark can build a parallel career, one that includes NBA media, national broadcasts, and mainstream influence, then the league is no longer the sole gatekeeper of opportunity. And that's the real reason the NBC deal felt so explosive. Not because she was leaving, but because she was expanding. And expansion creates contrast. It forces uncomfortable comparisons. It exposes structural weaknesses. It highlights who has leverage and who doesn't. The league suddenly found itself promoting a player who, for the first time, didn't need promotion to stay powerful. And instead of embracing that as a win, it hesitated. That hesitation revealed fear. Fear that Caitlin Clark's independence might encourage other players to seek leverage elsewhere. Fear that star power might move beyond the league's ability to frame it. Fear that the WNBA might not be the center of every story anymore. Which is ironic, because the league's long-term survival depends on exactly that kind of crossover relevance. But systems don't always act rationally when control is challenged. They react. And the reaction here wasn't to clarify or support. It was to delete and retreat. That's why the quit narrative resonated. Not because it was accurate, but because it reflected a deeper truth. Caitlin Clark no longer fits inside the box the league built. She's operating on a different plane, one where her value isn't defined solely by games played or minutes logged. And once that becomes obvious, the conversation shifts again. Because now the question isn't whether Caitlin Clark needs the WNBA. It's whether the WNBA is prepared for a future where its biggest star doesn't depend on it. That question terrified leadership. And it exposed the thing the league is really afraid of, something far bigger than one deal, one post, or one player. That's the final layer of this story. And once you see it clearly, everything the league did suddenly makes sense, even if it makes the situation worse. The WNBA isn't afraid of Caitlin Clark. That's the part people get wrong. They aren't scared of her talent. They aren't threatened by her work ethic. They aren't worried about her understanding of the game. What they're afraid of is what she represents. Because Caitlin Clark is proof of something the league has quietly tried to avoid confronting for years. That star power doesn't wait for permission. For a long time, the WNBA has operated under the belief that growth must be carefully curated, that attention needs to be evenly distributed, that no single player should become bigger than the league itself. On paper, that sounds noble. In reality, it's not how sports work. Every major league that has broken into mainstream relevance did so on the back of stars who bent the ecosystem around them. Players who drew eyeballs first, and legitimacy followed. The WNBA has always wanted that moment. What it didn't expect was how uncomfortable it would feel when it finally arrived. Caitlin Clark didn't just bring fans. She brought outside influence. She pulled in networks, sponsors, and conversations the league doesn't fully control. And control is the real issue here. The moment NBC elevated her as a basketball voice, not a novelty, not a side segment, but a legitimate analyst, it shifted the center of gravity away from the league office. Suddenly, the WNBA wasn't the only institution validating her. And that matters. Because once validation comes from outside, internal narratives lose their authority. You can't quietly reframe success when a national network is amplifying it loudly. You can't minimize impact when ratings, engagement, and reach tell a different story. That's what rattled the league. Not the backlash itself, but the realization that they couldn't contain the moment. Deleting the post was an attempt to regain control, to slow things down, to calm the noise, to reassert authority over the narrative. But it did the opposite. It exposed the fear. Fear of a future where the WNBA doesn't get to decide which stars matter most. Fear of players building parallel platforms. Fear of becoming a stepping stone instead of a destination. And here's the irony. That future is unavoidable. Modern athletes don't live inside single ecosystems anymore. They are brands, voices, and platforms of their own. The leagues that thrive are the ones that embrace that reality, not fight it. By hesitating, the WNBA revealed it's still caught between two identities. A traditional sports league that should reward performance, and a tightly managed cultural space where attention must be negotiated. Trying to be both is unsustainable. And Caitlin Clark forced that contradiction into the open. Her NBC deal wasn't an act of rebellion. It was a reflection of modern sports economics. But the league reacted like it was being challenged, not supported. That's the real lesson of the deleted post. It wasn't about one announcement. It wasn't about one comment section. It wasn't about one player. It was about a league coming face-to-face with a version of itself it hasn't fully accepted yet. A league where stars drive growth, where outside validation matters, where control has limits. And once that realization hit, everything else made sense. The silence, the retreat, the confusion. Because the WNBA didn't just lose control of a post. It momentarily lost control of the story. And now it stands at a crossroads. It can lean into the momentum Caitlin Clark and others helped create. Or it can keep hesitating every time that momentum gets uncomfortable. And that choice will decide whether 2024 was the beginning of something real, or just a brief glimpse of what could have been. When people look back on this moment, they probably won't remember the exact wording of the deleted post. They won't remember the timestamp. They won't remember which account reposted the screenshot first. They won't remember who tweeted what in the heat of the moment. What they will remember is what the deletion represented. A league standing at a crossroads, unsure whether to trust the very momentum it had spent years trying to create. Because this story was never really about Caitlin Clark quitting the WNBA. It was about the WNBA being confronted with a reality it hadn't fully prepared for. A reality where one of its players became bigger than internal narratives. Where validation came from outside the bubble. Where star power couldn't be neatly managed or evenly distributed. Caitlin Clark didn't ask for special treatment. She didn't demand exceptions. She didn't force her way into NBA media. She earned attention, and attention followed. That's how sports work. The uncomfortable truth is that 2024 proved the WNBA can thrive when it lets basketball lead the conversation. When games are treated seriously. When stars are allowed to shine without apology. When fans are invited in instead of managed. And for a moment, everything clicked. The NBC deal should have been a celebration of that progress. A sign that the league's reach was finally extending beyond its own walls. Instead, it became a stress test. And the league blinked. That doesn't mean the WNBA is doomed. It doesn't mean progress is gone. It doesn't mean the momentum can't be recovered. But it does mean a decision has to be made. You can't build a league on performance while policing visibility. You can't ask stars to grow the game and then panic when they succeed. You can't demand mainstream respect while shrinking from mainstream attention. Caitlin Clark will be fine either way. Her career is already bigger than one deal, one season, or one league decision. The real question is what the WNBA chooses to do next. Does it embrace the version of itself that fans showed up for in 2024? Or does it keep retreating every time growth gets uncomfortable? Because you can't delete your way into credibility. And you can't build the future by being afraid of it. The deleted post was a warning sign, not just for fans, but but for leadership. A reminder that growth requires confidence, that stars require support, and that hesitation costs more than backlash ever will. So now the choice is clear. Lean into the momentum, or let it slip away. And if you care about real basketball conversations, not manufactured outrage, not recycled talking points, but honest breakdowns of what's actually happening behind the scenes, then you already know why this matters. So if you want more deep dives like this, more stories that cut through the noise, and more breakdowns that treat women's basketball like the serious sport it is, make sure you're subscribed, because this conversation isn't over, and the next chapter is already unfolding.